My name is Dina Nawaz, and I manage the Learner's Voice program at WISE. And today we're here to discuss one of the most pressing challenges of our times, which is the global forced migration challenge. We have, in the past few years, witnessed unprecedented numbers of people on the move, the greatest since the Second World War. And with that, we are facing new challenges and some very familiar challenges. However, often overlooked, education seems to be a very urgent and critical lifeline for hundreds of thousands of people on the move and those who have been displaced by circumstances beyond their control. However, we've spent many years talking about the challenges that are faced by people on the move and refugees in particular. However, today we want to look at the innovations and the solutions around the world that are creating opportunities and providing skills and learning environments for refugees and people on the move to develop skills to successfully integrate into their host communities, as well as develop a key social and economic capital. So to delve a little deeper into these conversations, to understand what the current situation looks like and what's the road ahead, I want to introduce you all to our guests today. We have with us Gabriel Storing from IACT. He's the executive director and also founder of Little Ripples, which is an early childhood education initiative targeted at Darfuri refugees based in Chad. And his intervention takes a community-based approach at placing mothers at the center of the learning experience of young children, to give them the advantage early on to prepare for a life of often uncertainty and various restrictions and limited opportunities. We also have with us Dina Pasek, who's the co-founder and education manager at Second Tree. Second Tree is an initiative based in the north of Greece that provides opportunities for individuals to integrate into their host community, as well as develop skills and also participate in various learning opportunities such as language courses. And then finally, we have with us Grace Atkinson, who is the now executive director of Jasur and formerly worked at Chiron. And she's an expert on not only facilitating transition for refugees into higher education opportunities, but also creating those opportunities and especially funding opportunities for them to realize their full potential. So I'm really excited to have you all on board. Thank you very much. And to get the conversation started, Gabriel, since your initiative targets young children at the and at the very first stage of their journey, I want to understand sort of the gap that you're filling and the need you see on the ground, and tell us a little bit about your solution and how you came about it.
Sure. Thank you, Dina, and thank you, WISE, for hosting this important conversation on World Refugee Day. We began working on early childhood because the refugees asked us for it. We've been visiting refugee camps on the Chad-Sudan border since 2005, and from the very beginning, they expressed the need for programs that addressed not only immediate needs, but then also their sense of dignity. So one of the most innovative things about our program is that it is refugee led. So they the program from inception was theirs. It was their idea. We collaborated with them in the design, and then in implementation, they are the ones leading it. IACT is not on the ground over there right now. It's all refugees running the program. And to me, it's a little problematic that that's something innovative. That refugees lead their own programs and their own lives. I was just recently in Tanzania implementing Little Ripples with refugees from Burundi, and as we're talking about Little Ripples in early childhood and this great gap that exists when dealing with early education in refugee camps. They also wanted to talk about this sense of loss of power at being a refugee, and I asked them, how in control do you feel of your own lives? And they all said at the most 20%. So imagine losing everything, escaping horrible violence, arriving at a safe place, but then feel that you have no control over your own lives and no control over the future of your children. So as we talk about education and the needs and innovation in education, I think it's also very important to talk about how programs are implemented, not just that, not just look at numbers and that children are receiving education. It's how the community is involved and how programs are implemented.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And I think you bring up a very important point, which is not just about building skills and providing education, but it's actually enabling them to really leverage the skills that they already have, leverage their own capacity to build solutions for themselves. So that brings me to you, Dina. I know that in your initiative, you work with young people, but you also work with a lot of young adults who are eager to sort of find their place in their community, sort of continue their journeys of learning and really take ownership of their learning process as well. So could you tell me a little bit about the work that you're doing with specifically young adults and sort of really understanding their needs and how your organization comes into this?
Sure, thanks, Dina. I'm happy to be part of this webinar. And I mean, what Gabriel just said is really also at the heart of what got me involved in this line of work, and also my my team that co-founded Second Tree. So we are a really young organization, actually. We're just under 2 years old, and we all met in Katsikas in northern Greece, where we independent volunteers to just understand a little bit better what was happening in Europe, what was happening in Greece, why it was happening, and what we as individuals could do to contribute to some sort of solution. We came with different skills, and through that experience, we realized that regardless of the kind of skills we were coming with, we all shared the same ethos, which was to try and challenge this culture of dependency that's being fostered by aid organizations on the ground. We realized, I mean, again, through just the experiences that we had in this particular camp, that empowerment was not a key component of what the humanitarian sector was doing and how the actors that we at least were interacting with were operating. And we thought, okay, what's the best way that we could engage anyone who's interested, but specifically young people? So we noticed a gap in programming for youth aged 15 and up, who for us were one of the most vulnerable groups, really, because they were the ones that were sort of in the process of forming their identities as teenagers, as young people, but at the same time going through something so horrific and without any real understanding of what situation they found themselves in, that we thought, okay, how could we help them process their reality better, understand what Europe offers, what the legal systems here mean. And so language learning really was the first step to that. We realized that without them, I mean, again, there's a massive shortage of translators on the ground. There's a massive shortage of capacity building in host organizations. So we thought, okay, how do we give them the life skills that they need to navigate this new reality of theirs? And it began with language lessons, English at first, but then we realized that, you know, education was kind of a byproduct, not byproduct, like a side initiative in a way, like nobody was really prioritizing it. And so when people did end up doing language classes, the quality was terrible. It was anyone who speaks English would be thrown into a tent and asked to do something. And for me, this was completely unacceptable, given the fact that there is capacity out there to, you know, put together a quality program. So this is what we decided to do. We work mainly with volunteers, qualified teachers in both English and Greek now. And our main aim is to empower young people in the context of these two programs, but we do other ones as well, with the skills needed to first communicate and re-engage in society again. And from that, hopefully, have them participate long enough to sit for an accredited language test, which again would then enable them to engage in employment or further academia.
All right, thank you so much. And again, congratulations on your new initiative, which is doing quite well in its very early years as well. Grace, I'm aware you also work with a very similar demographic. You work with young adults, and again, they are a vulnerable group with limited opportunities to engage in. And one of your initiative sort of tries to build those opportunities and actually provide access to those opportunities. So maybe you can tell us a little bit about your work and sort of what are the key needs that you see with the young adults that you work with.
Absolutely. So there's two things I'd kind of like to touch on here. The first is regarding access to higher education. As you may know, less than 1% of refugees worldwide actually have the opportunity of around 20% of the youth worldwide. So there's obviously a huge issue in helping refugees to access higher educational opportunities. And then there's the big question of what's after. Even whether you've not studied at a higher educational level, once you've arrived in the new country, what do you do? What are your opportunities, especially for economic livelihoods and longer-term integration for the conflicts which are ongoing? We really need to start thinking about solutions of how we start to tackle these problems head-on. With regards to some of the initiatives that I've worked with previously and I'm working with now, Cairo Open Higher Education is a blended learning program where refugee learners can start to study online from anywhere in the world. And then after around 6 months to a year of studying online, they can then transfer to a partner university who recognizes the credits that they've taken online. So I think this is a great kind of example of an innovative method of trying to tackle higher education for refugees and bringing in these elements of flexibility, online learning at a very high educational quality and also completely for free. But this is very much on the early stage when students have finished high school and they're thinking about going to university, maybe trying some different courses, for example, and then as they're relocated to the third country, to the country that they're likely to be spending the longest amount of time in. Obviously, many students, refugee students, are looking for scholarship opportunities, which is where Jusso, the organization that I'm currently working for, and several others within the sector are working with universities and colleges and funding bodies to pay for the scholarships for these students to go to university. So that's with regards to the higher education aspect. We know that we're currently still not doing enough, but there's definitely initiatives out there. But looking more towards the workforce, I mean, what's being done in the sector with regards to economic integration. I think there's a couple of very good examples of coding schools out there. I've seen a couple in the Middle East, in Lebanon and in Jordan, but from conferences that they're worldwide offering coding to refugees. But what about other opportunities? One of the ones that we're tackling with Jusso is entrepreneurship, giving entrepreneurship training and seed funding to groups of Syrians who have an idea and would love to pursue it. And I think it's something that it's another option of where kind of refugees can go into. And also the local vocational training, I think, is rather underrated, working with local community colleges in the host country in order to retrain refugees. And just kind of one more comment to wrap up the part about the workforce integration. If we think about the main barriers that refugees are facing in accessing the labour market, there's ones that can be overcome with reskilling and with the education, such as language, such as hard and soft skills, which students are lacking. But there's also kind of different challenges, such as the legal challenges. Do people need to get a work permit when they arrive in the new country? How do they go about that? Is there enough work permits for the number of refugees in the country? And also issues in the Middle East, like high unemployment in the host countries. So I think to an extent we should definitely be looking into educational opportunities in order to be able to offer longer term prospects to refugees, especially the youth. But also as NGOs, we should be working with the governments of the host countries and also with the private sector in order to make sure these are sustainable and fruitful opportunities.
Thank you so much, Grace, for telling us about your work with both Jasur and Kyron. And from what I gather from the three of you, it looks like there is a real need and a real urgency to really break the web of dependency on aid that often refugees find themselves in their countries of asylum or in their host countries as well. And oftentimes just access to education isn't enough. It's really creating a methodology or creating a skill-based lifelong learning tools for them to really engage with and take ownership of their learning environments at different stages of their journey and at different ages as well. It's not just limited to young children in the refugee camps in Chad, or nor is it just limited to integration into the labor force. So that being said, I want to hear from all three of you, or either of you, about really understanding how do we reimagine sort of learning for refugees to really develop the skills to break these cycles of dependencies and really be empowered and be integrated both socially and economically into their host communities. So what kind of learning are we looking at? What kind of skills do they need to get to that stage? And how can we enable that?
If I can jump in, I think so. We've finally accepted and realized that refugees, once they become a refugee, are going to be there a long time. They're going to be refugees on average over 17 years. So we have to move from this emergency setting mentality of kind of coming in and thinking of stopgap measures just while they're there. They're going to be there. They're from some kids from when they're born, until they become adults. So starting with that, how do we come up with programs that are deep and where we think of quality from the very beginning? But again, I have to go back also at the process. The refugees have to be included from the very beginning in this process of imagining their own education and imagining their own future. It is just not right for us and for the humanitarian community to imagine it for them. They come, they experience horrible violence, but they come with skills just like any other population. They are the experts in their own community. They know their children better than anybody. So we have to give them access to the creation of their own programs and then the support. The numbers are just so huge. It's over 30 million children are refugees right now. It is bigger than countries themselves. So there's not going to be an easy one solution for all of these different contexts. Greece is very different from some of the camps I go to in Africa, and then and even within these contexts in Africa, they're very different one from another. Some have no access to even the local opportunity, so they have no freedom of movement. That they have no say on their future. So it's going to take a lot of work and courageous leadership that are willing to go in a different direction and challenge the status quo.
Thank you, Gabriel. And just a follow up to what you mentioned, which is absolutely that we agree with. From the work that you've been doing on the ground for many years now, I want to understand how you see yourself until the political will gains the momentum that is needed. How do you see yourself sort of building that continuity and building a program that's embedded in the needs and is user-centric and where refugees are involved, but also scaling it to ensure that it's a long-term program where there is continuity between the different students that come through your program and where they they go after your program ends. So I just want to understand your vision for your program and how you see some of the values being embedded in it moving forward.
Sure. I think the big investment has to be in people. So not on four walls and the school setting itself. And then when we think of programming, we shouldn't be limited by the term refugee. They are human beings. The children are children just like our own. So when we work with the refugees and coming up with programs, it should be dreaming about programs as if it was for our own children, and then give them all the support. For us, we jumped into the education field reluctantly. The refugees told us about the need for early childhood, and there's very, very little effort and money put into the early stages, and all of science shows that if you don't invest in those early years, you're going to be dealing with that group for their entire lives. So we just think that, bang for the buck. If you think of it as an investment, investing in early childhood is just the greatest investment you can make. And then again, in the process of implementing these programs, we're preparing refugees. We're working with them. And preparing them to run their own programs. They become experts in running a program. They're the teachers, they're the cooks, they're the administrators. No matter what happens later in their lives, they're going to take those skills with them, and that's going to be invaluable for their community.
Thank you. And Dina, moving to you, you work with young adults and you focus a lot on soft skills as well, as you mentioned. So it looks like it is one of those transferable skills that they can carry with them at different stages of their journey. And despite how limited opportunities are for them because of legal and other restrictions, they seem to sort of open opportunities for them in wherever they are. So I just want to understand how the role of soft skills in your opinion, and how you envision it developing in your initiative, and what the future of that could look like in enabling a long-term program for them.
Yeah, so soft skills for us, we realized how critical they were just from within the classroom setting. So a lot of the time people would go in and assume that, okay, I have to deliver a lesson. You have this kind of breakdown of a lesson and objectives that you think that a classroom setting requires, but then you realize that people aren't even able to sit down or engage in a meaningful way because they are unable to sort of comprehend the situation that they find themselves in. They're refusing to accept it. So we decided to turn our classroom spaces, or whatever you want to call them, temporary learning spaces, into places where people would just come, and through English we would try and engage with them and get them kind of out of the mentality that they had that was very kind of negative and not wanting to be where they are. Greece, for a lot of people, is not the place they want to be. It's a place that they got stuck in because the border is closed. So it's taken, and it still is taking a long time for people to understand that this is their home for now. And so once we sort of got over that hurdle, we realized that if through different activities we could basically teach them English, but without it seeming like a class. So for example, with our Youth Scouts program, the main objective was to get the kids out of the camps. And through that, we were able to build these young kids into role models for their communities. So it was modeled against the global scouting movement that would basically take kids into the environment, into the mountains, and teach them about nature and teach them about things that they may have not before had access to, but inadvertently also teaching them to work together, addressing gender stereotypes. So before we had to really build trust with the parents, where we would kind of try and bring girls and boys together to go out into any kind of activity. And over time, we were able to essentially place girls and boys on an equal pedestal, which for us was a huge achievement, because a month before, they weren't even able to be in the same room together. And this really demonstrated how confidence can be built in young people through activities that weren't necessarily something that they had traditionally. And so this remains a core component of all our programs. Life skills through education, through scouts, through activities that traditionally are sort of from a school setting.
Thank you. And again, I want to turn to you, Grace, because you work on facilitating transition into more formal education opportunities, whereas what Dina mentioned is sort of using education as a tool to build life skills. I want to understand from you, Grace, sort of what are some of the skills that you feel could support the students that you work with to really access those opportunities, those often limited opportunities available to them, and those limited workforce opportunities? What are some of the critical needs that your students in your network face when accessing these opportunities?
Absolutely. So one of the kind of key areas that we've realized there's a lot of improvements could be made is, and I mean, they're very simple. They're kind of the areas that we often don't really think about. Things like CV writing, careers advice, applications for scholarships. I think they're coming from I hate to say it, but Western education system from the US and from Europe, where we're very used to kind of having to self-reflect and write a CV, or writing a scholarship application, saying what you've done previously, or a university application even. Whereas, especially in the countries that we're working in, this is this kind of critical thinking and self-reflection is not taught in the same way in schools, and therefore many of the students don't have the skills required to even put together, for example, a basic CV. I mean, they can do it, but it's not appealing. It's not competitive internationally as they would need to be in order to access the opportunities in the labour market. So some of the kind of the programs that we've put together are a very simple CV review program where students can send their CV and then they can have a one-on-one session with one of our volunteers and one of our successful Syrians who will give them feedback on their CV, kind of where can the improvements be made. We also offer a very basic kind of careers advice service, able to guide the students. We've produced webinars where we will have interviews with deans of universities and explain a little bit about their application process and some of the different programs that they offer, which allows students to broaden their minds into the different opportunities which are available, and then also ongoing mentoring. So once you have a group of successful students, not just abandoning them when they go to university or when they start a business, for example, making sure that contact is ongoing and with people who have been through in a similar situation and have come out of the other side and therefore have shared life experiences. And I think that these are just several points which we could probably scale to any of the different scenarios that we're working in order to have a huge impact. And simple programs, actually.
Thank you. And considering the renewed focus on skills and transferable skills or life skills that you've all mentioned, and also on the focus on lifelong learning, I want to understand how adults can benefit from the initiatives that the three of you work in and sort of the opportunities available to them, because often the education opportunities for adults are quite limited, and there are additional challenges working with adults as well because of their experiences, the experience that they already come with, and because most of them are often trying to integrate into the workforce, and that in itself poses a number of other challenges. So I want to understand how sort of what your thoughts are on how adults can benefit from the programs you run, and or what solutions could be in place for them.
Adults also make a core component of our demographic. Actually, it's probably majority adult. So, and I don't mean 18 plus, I mean sort of 30 plus. But like, so they basically, the problem with adults, or at least the kind of what we've seen, is how basically, because young people learn faster and have more opportunities open to them, they actually become kind of the spokesperson for that. So we have is where the children are the young people that we work with, which is basically 11 to 17, if in the context of like an age group, are the main communicator between parents, legal actors, NGO, the government, and they're basically the ones who are kind of in positions of power because of all the information that they receive and then interpret for their parents. And so we've actually, for us, the kind of dynamic that plays out between young people and adults in our classroom is really interesting, because you end up having young people helping out the adults who a lot of the time may be completely illiterate, so in their own languages. So English or Greek may be their first language that they're learning, but regardless of their literacy, they're very, very adamant about picking up this skill. So in terms of engaging them, we have had, I mean, program targets, but it's interesting to observe how the adult ends up taking a sort of back seat in the entire kind of process of integration in the context of Greece, at least, because of how quickly their children or young people around them pick up the information. And so we've had like many examples of, because again, the people we work with don't want to stay here, so they find any kind of way to leave. And as much as we can tell them or advise them against it because it compromises their status in Europe, they still leave. So we've had many sort of phone calls from our previous students who have just said, like, thank you so much for pushing us into learning while we were there, despite us not wanting to engage in anything, because the minute we got to Germany, the minute we got to Sweden, the minute we got to any other European country, English was the language that enabled us to communicate and understand where we are and from get to place A to place B. And this for us was a very powerful lesson, because I'm sure you can tell people at the time, like, you have, you're here, you're kind of stuck here for now, use it wisely. But at the same time, now we see the impact. And we use that as an example for the people we work with now.
Thank you, Dina. Would anyone else want to jump in on tackling the challenges and opportunities in working with adults?
Yeah, for us, when we started looking at preschool for refugees, all the focus was on the children and the impact that the children would receive and what their needs were. But as soon as we began training these young refugee women to be the teachers, it was just amazing to see the transformation for them and for their lives. These were young women that were girls when they escaped their homeland and horrible violence they experienced themselves. And they missed out on their childhood. And then giving them the tools to offer their children state-of-the-art education. It was just transformative for them, and for the first time that they got to play and learn through play, and then see that they had the power to pass on this to their children. And now they're the ones helping us expand the program. So when we go to another refugee camp, they're the ones teaching other young refugee women how they can become teachers. So the power in that is amazing when you see these young women looking at other refugee women and saying, you know, I can be like her. I can be this experienced, powerful woman. And these teachers are telling us that they go to meetings now where they didn't used to be present, and they feel that they have a voice and they can speak for themselves. So it has been a powerful experience to see this. And just our main coordinator in the camps, a refugee himself, Umda Tarbash, he had 45 family members killed in 1 week. In just 1 week of violence, 45 members killed. And now you meet him, and he's the most joyful, positive, skilled person you would ever meet. He runs all the programs. He knows about the meal program. He knows about construction for the for the places for the children. They just come with amazing skills themselves, and if you give them the opportunity and the support, they're going to be able to take care of their own children.
Thank you, Gabriel. Just moving ahead, I mean, there's no doubt that there are numerous challenges sort of addressing the various needs of people on the move, those displaced and refugees, and the needs are different in different contexts, and the methods have to be catered to those contexts and those age groups as well. That being said, there is also a lot of good examples of things working quite well. The three of your initiatives are sort of set those examples of small-scale initiatives that are creating impact, that are delivering results. So I really want to understand, given the years, the conversations, this conversation is not new, this has been going on for quite some time. So I really want to understand from your perspectives, sort of how to scale the results of some of your initiatives, and also how to scale results of initiatives that are working well. How can we address the needs of the many thousands of displaced people and refugees around the world who do not have access to your individual programs. So I really want to understand from your perspective, what is the way forward, and how do we really meet the needs of the many thousands who we aren't able to at the moment?
For us, actually, WISE was an important part of our being able to scale up. Winning the award 2 years ago gave us a platform, and others saw the work, and it was very important. Just our approach from the beginning of having the refugees lead makes it more cost effective. So again, they're the ones that are the main component in the scaling up. They go to other camps and help us train and prepare the next generation of leaders in other camps. I think it's being able to look at innovative ways of doing things, not just following the same formula that has been followed for over decades, and we can see it from these programs that here in this chat. It's just being willing to look at things differently.
I think if I can just jump in as well, there is a responsibility, in my opinion, on the donor side as well, to ensure that we're not constantly reinventing the wheel. If you look at some of the programs, I don't know, for example, like the boot camps, which, as I said, are coding boot camps, which I'm a huge fan of. I think that they're doing some great work, but you have, I don't know, maybe 20 or 30 different organizations now running in different companies who have developed entirely their own curriculum from scratch and are running different boot camps, which are not, it's not sustainable, because instead of investing on scaling one or two good models, we keep reinventing the wheel. And I think from the donor side, there should be a lot of due diligence on what's already being done and how can we support initiatives that are already there, instead of constantly trying to be innovative and find new things, and therefore not necessarily choosing the best run option or even the cheapest option, just trying to find something new constantly.
I think that's a very important point, Grace. That why replicate programs that already exist? So we don't have staff on the ground in any of the settings that we work in. It's NGOs that already have all the structure, everything in place, that bring us in. So they're willing to let go of ego and say, this other program has has what we need. And even though it was created by them, we're going to bring them in because they have that expertise, and we'll let them do it. And for us, it just wouldn't make sense to go open offices in all these countries and have vehicles and staff when the refugees are there already. So yeah, I think that's very important. Just why replicate things?
For us, we were found in a situation where we were the only ones offering education, so it was very obvious how low a priority this was for ECHO, who ultimately was pulling funds out of very functional operations here on the ground in Epirus, which consists of 5 different camps in the region. And we realized that we had to step up. I mean, as a really small organization, learning the ways of working in a humanitarian context, we soon found ourselves in a situation where we were the only ones offering educational opportunities for people, and many others. And so we, at the moment, I think, are still trying to figure out what scaling up would even look like. And of course, like both of you had said, replicating is not an option, and we don't necessarily think that we're the most innovative, but we are definitely necessary. And so it would be interesting, and I've been speaking to a lot of people recently who are also trying to figure out the same thing of how we can all share the expertise we have, the knowledge we have, and between each other, so that we don't have to be sort of recreating everything time and again. Because really, what we need is out there. It's just a matter of people actually taking initiative and implementing it, which I thought was something that just happened until I was found in a situation where it wasn't happening. And yeah, for us, really what we try to do is try and build better collaborations between the actors that work here on the ground, so that if there is a gap in programming for one organization, we can step in to do it. And as we found very little support in implementing what we're trying to do, despite everybody saying how important it is that there are educational opportunities for refugees in the different camps, we've been successful on a small scale in working with other like-minded grassroots organizations that, you know, in the context of a camp such as Katsikas, which recently reopened, where for about 5 months no one had access to any sort of basic services, our friends across the road, Habibi Works, offered us their space. We had the teachers, and another organization gave us the resources. So through like more interagency collaboration and less competition, which we see a lot of, unfortunately, we've been able to context.
Thank you, Dina, and thank you, everyone. I think despite the various complexities that you're facing in your everyday work, I think there's still lots to be optimistic about, just by the fact that you're on the ground and offering support and enabling displaced people, refugees, and people on the move to really find those opportunities and access them, and really fulfill their aspirations through them. Before we move on to our Q&A session, because of the limited time that we have, I really want to, I mean, there's no doubt that economic integration and just having the right to work helps refugees break the cycle of dependence, gives them the ownership, and gives them a real opportunity to rebuild their lives. So given sort of the urgent conversations around enabling the right to work and skilling and reskilling refugees for the job market, I want to hear from some of you about sort of how to enable that transition into the workforce despite all the legal and social barriers that exist to it, and what that pipeline to entry into the workforce looks like, given all the challenges that you've mentioned.
I mean, I think for this question, it very much depends on what country you're in. I think in a lot of the European countries, the rights to access work come as you get your refugee permit and a kind of residency, and then you have immediate rights to access work opportunities. You can apply as any other European. Kind of where we could focus there would be the stage previous to that. So before you, in the time between arriving in a country and having the permit that allows you to work, what are you doing with your time? How long does it take? Is there a language that you have to learn? If you're in France, do you have to learn French? If you're in Italy, if you're in Greece, do you have the right skills to work in the country that you've now arrived in? If you're a builder in Syria or in Afghanistan, does that necessarily mean that you can immediately go out and start building in your new country? So what are the steps that we can take to support people as much as possible before they're legally able to access working opportunities? Because it's wasting time again if you're doing it afterwards. And this is something that, in my experience, since a lot of governments in Europe are not able to do very well at the moment, and where NGOs could step in a bit more to provide the support and the reskilling. And that's a look at Europe. And then I think it's completely different. For example, if you look towards the Middle East, you look at Lebanon, Turkey, and Jordan, where, I mean, in Lebanon, where I'm sitting right now, it's pretty much legal for all refugees, Syrian refugees, to find work. So we can talk about reskilling and training opportunities, I mean, until all day, and still legally they're not able to do it, which is pushing either them into dependency on aid, or I think more frequently into the informal working sector, where basically no regulations are apparent. There's a similar situation in Jordan where the working permits are limited. So I think that we should take it on a case-by-case basis of what context are we working in and what steps can we take, and also how can we work with the governments. I think that NGOs have a tendency to forget that in a lot of the context they're working in, there's a completely functioning system who were functioning before they came along and would love to work with us in order to find a future together, and we provide the expertise that we have, and they provide the finances and the expertise that they have. So, yeah.
All right. Thank you, Grace. And of course, the legal barriers is one of, and sort of the lack of political will has also been sort of a central tenet of this conversation around the right to work. And you very aptly sort of summarized this challenge and how it's very dependent on the context. Unfortunately, we are out of time for the discussion period, but we have a number of questions from our viewers about the conversation. So thank you all, and I'll get started with the questions right now. So the first question we have is actually for Dina Pasic, and it is a follow-up to the conversation about the right to work. So our viewer would like to know, so their worry is that those in Syria may not be able to find jobs after being equipped with skills. So they want to know that in the Syrian context, how will they find jobs after they're equipped with the life skills that you mentioned?
Okay, in the Syrian, I'm not in Syria, so I can't really comment on the Syrian context, and I feel like there it's a war. So what I'm talking about is in the context of Greece and a kind of post-emergency phase where the focus on life skills for us is predominantly to retain people. So to get them feeling comfortable, to get them to want to spend time in our classrooms. And this is something that's always been a priority for us because we know psychosocial of people who have fled war should be a top priority for everything, and figuring out ways to empower them through different activities is our goal. So the development of life skills, of communication skills, of language skills is predominantly to get them to re-engage in society again, and through our programs, if they choose to stay, they could prepare for certification in that particular language, which in the context of Greece and other European countries is usually a prerequisite for further education or employment. So I'm not saying that life skills equals job, but it's a step along the way to further socioeconomic integration. And especially because also in the context of Greece, there are no jobs. I mean, they are themselves in a really bad economic situation, which is something that refugees don't, because about Europe is very skewed. So what we try to do is, one, also engage with less advantaged people, local people. So for example, our English courses are open to Greeks who don't have the opportunity to study a language in another institution. So we work with people on social welfare. We're also trying to target individuals working in host institutions. So for example, in hospitals and schools, and inviting them to Arabic classes, which are delivered by refugees themselves in order to build their capacity in that way. So kind of building bridges between the different communities that eventually have to become one community. And also working with governments to figure out ways of decreasing bureaucracy, or at least loosening it up a little bit, so that we could explore things like social entrepreneurship, like Grace also mentioned, is something that we really are thinking of ways to equip refugees with, because they come with skills, they come very well educated, they come as people with careers, and how do we then translate what the skills that they come with into the kind of structures that exist in this host community? And that's a conversation that we're lobbying for change in, essentially. So I don't think I've answered their question for Syrians in Syria, but at least in the context of Greece, there are many different avenues that we're trying to explore in this already quite complicated local context.
Well, thank you, Dina. And I guess it still goes back to sort of the conversation we were having about the context when it comes to right to work, and the situation would look very different in Syria than in Greece, as opposed to in Chad or in Jordan or Lebanon. So we have another question. I think this is for anyone to answer from our viewers. So what are some of the legal impediments making equipping refugees with education difficult?
I think, again, that's going to be very different depending on the context. Some of the contexts that I work in are very limiting. In the camps in Eastern Chad, it's 12 refugee camps that have been there for 14 years. The refugees have no right to move. So they call these camps open prisons. What they have is it's just what they get. That there are no options, and above that, recently the players in this situation decided to change the curriculum, the primary and secondary curriculum from Sudanese, which is where the refugees come from, to Chadian, which is the host community. It seems like a good idea, but in general, the refugees didn't agree with it, and they felt that they were losing even more of their home and their culture. So they didn't feel really a part in the conversation, even though they were some physically present in these meetings. The barriers and difficulties and challenges are just huge in some of these settings, and I know it's going to be different in each setting. So I think the big what we need is dynamic advocates for the refugees, and where you really give them a voice and allow them to be a part of the conversation on how to access more opportunities in their own context.
Thank you, Gabriel. Okay. I think we have time.
Okay,
Yeah.
I had one positive thing I was gonna share about at least the European context. So while in Greece it's really costly actually for people they have to have all their certificates, if they have them with them, transcribed into Greek through a certain process that's just, again, bureaucracy overload. There's something called the European Qualifications Passport for Refugees, which was a pilot that has begun last year, and it's on a very small scale in the sense that they're just started the second cycle, I think, where they are inviting refugees to apply for. You basically get a document that allows you to travel to study if you get accepted in a university somewhere in the EU. So this is something that, again, is a development that, again, isn't going to really solve the issues that we're discussing here, purely because the numbers are so staggering and it in itself is a pilot phase.
Thank you, Dina. And yeah, it's one to watch. It was really good when we first heard about it, and something that the learners on our program are discussing as well. So yeah, it's one to watch. We have time for one last question, and I think this is a good one to really bring this conversation to a close. So the last question is, do you believe that the education situation for refugee children is soon to improve? If not, what is the best advice you have for hopeful change makers?
It has to improve. There is just, it's not an option. There are close to 65 million refugees in the world. If as a community, the world does not come together and make all the effort to work with refugees to improve their education, to improve the future of this huge population, we're all going to deal with it. The world is just too small to ignore this. So I have hope, and again, with groups like this, with WISE, with other players that are jumping in the game, and then with the UN Refugee Agency and NGOs that have decades of experience, I think it will get better.
Thank you.
From my side, I often tend to under the power of digitalization to be able to deliver high quality education en masse. And I'm hoping this is what the future of refugee education using digital technologies in order to allow almost immediate rollout into emergency settings, with some localization in the native language of the students, and probably in blended method, using the local school teachers as well.
I also try and remain hopeful despite, I don't know, seeing a lot that suggests otherwise. But I think, as Gabriel and Grace had also mentioned before, capacity building within refugee populations is also is something that that I personally think is a way to deal with the education issues and gaps that we face. Because while maybe host countries will struggle with integrating and really trying to get refugee children or refugees into the structures that exist within their communities, looking at how we can build capacity within the refugee community, how we can get them to establish the programs that they need to better integrate, is something that I think we should look into, such as trainings, working with different organizations that could build capacity. I think this for me is a sort of kind of a hopeful avenue that could be pursued, so that we're not relying so much on governments to do things and on huge international NGOs to do things who already have funding issues, but how can we also on a civil society level empower those that could potentially be change makers in their own communities.
And one more just crazy idea, what if we teach peace a little more, so that we avoid war and we avoid the violence that is creating this huge refugee issue?
Absolutely, I couldn't agree any more with you. Sort of nipping the problem at the very early stage, even before it becomes a problem. But with that said, due to the interest of time, this is the end of this discussion, and I want to thank you all, Grace, Gabriel, and Dina, for taking the time to discuss this with me on this World Refugee Day. And this by no means is the end of this conversation. This has been an ongoing conversation and will continue to be so. I hope we can participate in these conversations and actually translate them into action as we move forward. And before I wrap up, I really want to congratulate you all for all the wonderful work that you're doing on the ground, and very much needed work. And thank you all so much for your time. And yeah, we hope to be in touch. Thank you all.